I've never liked family lunches. This might sound strange, as I'm the type of person who usually loves being surrounded by people. But at gatherings like that, there was always something that made me uncomfortable. The questions. They seemed inevitable, as if everyone expected me to have an explanation for my life. The same thing every time. And you, Clara, when are you going to have kids? Or, don't you think it's time to think about starting a family? More and more, I felt a weight, a pressure, as if it were a failure not to follow the path that everyone seemed to think was obvious. I never wanted to be a mother. I always thought life had more to offer me than following a predetermined script. I tried to smile and ignore it, as I always did, but the words began to hit harder. Sometimes it felt like everyone had an opinion about my life. Why not have kids? Why not get married? And then, at this lunch, which already had that dense and uncomfortable atmosphere, something happened. Something I didn't expect, but that would change everything. As the conversation dragged on, my mom casually mentioned that Jamie, my 10-year-old nephew, had been placed into the adoption system. Those words caught me by surprise. I knew my sister Laura was struggling, but I never imagined something like this would happen. I wasn't close to Laura. Our relationship had always been somewhat distant, especially after she got lost in her own battles with addiction. But hearing that Jamie was out of the house, away from his mother, was like a punch to the stomach. A shock that reverberated through my whole being. I felt something tight in my chest, a mix of sadness, guilt, and maybe even anger. Anger at myself, perhaps, for not being more involved in his life, for not noticing that he was being affected by all the chaos my sister caused. I'd always tried to keep my distance as if it were easier, but now, sitting at that table, looking at the faces of everyone who kept asking their empty questions, I realized that distance didn't make sense. I should have been there. And suddenly, I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. I tried to push the thoughts away and focus on what my mom was saying, but the truth was, my mind was elsewhere. Jamie was out there somewhere, a 10-year-old boy, thrown into the system because his mother couldn't even take care of herself, let alone him. And I, who had always lived my life without worrying about responsibilities beyond my own, felt an increasing sense of obligation. Something inside me, which I couldn't quite name, told me I couldn't just let this happen. I had to do something. That lunch, which should have been just another moment where I tried to go unnoticed, was now becoming a turning point. I knew my life was about to change, but I had no idea how or in which direction it would go. What I did know was that I couldn't just stand still, watching from a distance while my nephew, who had always been so quiet and reserved, suffered from something I should have noticed sooner. I didn't know where to start, but the idea of acting grew inside me with a force I couldn't ignore. And as much as it was completely outside my comfort zone, a part of me already knew that, somehow, from that moment on, my life would have more meaning. I couldn't just wait for things to resolve on their own anymore, and that's how it all began. After that lunch, something changed within me. I could no longer ignore what was happening to Jamie. Guilt consumed me, and the feeling that I should have done something sooner grew heavier and heavier. I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for the situation to resolve itself. So, I decided to do something I had never done before, take the first step. I contacted social services to learn more about the adoption process and somehow found out how to meet Jamie. I didn't know what to expect, but I also couldn't imagine the possibility of not trying. I couldn't continue with my normal life while my nephew was so lost. The moment I received confirmation that I could see him, a mix of anxiety and nervousness took over me. I had done this on impulse, without truly understanding what it entailed. I didn't know if he would be open to meeting me, or if he would even recognize me as someone he could trust. I knew nothing about how this meeting would go, but I knew that somehow I needed to be there. I arrived at the place where Jamie was, and when I saw him for the first time, my heart tightened. He was sitting in a chair, his eyes down, almost immersed in his own thoughts. There were no smiles, no energy, like I imagined a 10-year-old boy should have. He was closed off, as if the world had lost its ability to surprise him. Something in his gaze told me that he had seen and felt more than any child his age should ever carry. I watched him for a few moments, not knowing exactly what to do. I didn't want to invade his space, but at the same time, something pushed me to get closer. I wasn't there to make promises or to suddenly fill the emptiness in his life. I knew it would be a slow process, but something inside me wanted him to know that I was willing to be there, to begin rebuilding the trust he needed to have in someone. Maybe we wouldn't form an immediate friendship, but at least I wanted to be a point of support, something stable for him. The first thing I noticed was the silence. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to be invasive, but at the same time, I didn't want to leave that space empty, as if what happened there didn't matter. I looked at him, trying to find a way to open a door. What did he want? What did he need? I didn't know, and this emptiness between us seemed almost tangible. And that's when, without realizing it, I realized how much he was actually afraid. Not of me, but of the idea of being rejected again, of not finding in anyone the stability he so desperately needed. His life had been a sequence of losses and uncertainties. I decided not to pressure him. I didn't want to force a connection because I knew it might push him further away. I stayed seated, near him, but without invading his space. I was just a presence, quiet and discreet, waiting for him to make the first move. Time passed in an almost strange silence. But something inside me told me that this was the beginning, and that the simple fact of me being there was already an important step. When at last he looked me in the eyes, there was no anger or resistance, just a gaze that seemed lost, as if trying to understand who I was and what I truly wanted. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I had the sense that he wanted to believe that maybe, here, there was something he could trust. It wasn't immediate love. It wasn't a grand revelation. It was just the beginning of something I still didn't know much about. When the visit ended, something had changed. Jamie didn't pull away immediately as I expected. He gave me a look, a small gesture, maybe the first spark of trust. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that the road would be long, but at that moment, I felt that something was beginning to be rebuilt, slowly. The pain and weight of my decision were still there, but something inside me told me that, for the first time, I was doing the right thing. I wasn't just watching anymore, I was beginning to act. The days following our first meeting weren't easy. I knew Jamie had his own battles, his own scars, and that it would be a long road before he saw me as someone he could trust. But there was something else there, something that gave me the strength to keep going. I didn't know what he thought yet, but I knew he needed someone, and I was determined to be that person, even if I didn't know how. All I wanted was for him to know that I was there to stay. I started visiting him more often. Each visit brought a little more trust, a little more space to understand who he really was, to learn about his needs, and of course, his passions. It was during one of these visits that something caught my attention. I walked into the room where he was, and I saw him focused, leaning over a blank sheet of paper. He was drawing. It wasn't anything extraordinary, not in the sense of being a work of art, but the way he immersed himself in it surprised me. It was as if the paper was a kind of escape for him. With each line, with each shape, he was there, creating a small universe of his own, away from the shadows of the past that still haunted him. He looked up at me quickly, as if bothered by my watching, but didn't take his eyes off the drawing. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. That moment told me more than any words ever could. I realized he wasn't just a lost child. He was someone trying to find his place in a world that hadn't treated him well. The drawing was more than a distraction. It was his way of dealing with the pain, trying to express something he didn't know how to say. I started bringing drawing materials for him. Pencils, paints, blank papers. Without saying much, just offering what he already seemed to enjoy. As time passed, I noticed he began to seek me out more, always with a new drawing to show me. He didn't speak much, but his eyes lit up in a different way when he talked about what he had drawn. For Jamie, those scribbles were telling the story he couldn't put into words. He spoke about the monsters in his head, the desire to escape, everything around him, the happy moments that apparently were still there, but well hidden. I began to see more through his drawings than he could ever say verbally. He was showing me what he felt in a unique way, and that gave me a new understanding of his pain. With each new drawing, I felt more connected to him. It was as if that piece of paper was the only place where he truly felt safe. And, slowly, the idea that he might find something positive amid all this started to take shape in my mind. I began to believe more than ever that Jamie had a lot of potential. He wasn't lost. He just needed someone to guide him, to show him that he had a possible future, a future different from what he had known. Weeks went by, and our routine began to form in a way that felt natural to me. I would accompany him to his drawing sessions, and he would proudly show me his progress, shy but proud. Each drawing he handed me was a small step in our journey, a journey that, until that moment, I didn't know where it would lead. But one thing was clear. I was starting to see Jamie differently. He was no longer the distant, lost nephew. He was a boy with dreams, with fears, with a hidden talent that, if well nurtured, could bloom. What started as a simple act of concern began to transform into something more. I didn't just want to help Jamie recover. I wanted to see him shine. I wanted to be the person who would help him find his way. I started thinking about what I could do to give him more than just emotional support. How could I help him achieve his dreams? How could I help him be who he had always been, without letting life's circumstances define him? And it was then that, for the first time, I found myself thinking about the possibility of adopting him. I knew this decision would be a huge responsibility, one that would change everything in my life. But something inside me told me that if I didn't do it, no one else would. Jamie didn't just need someone who cared. He needed someone who truly believed in him, someone who saw in him all the potential I was beginning to see. And, little by little, this desire to be more than just a visitor in his life grew inside me. I wanted to be the mother he never had, even if that meant having to change everything in my life. With every new drawing, every silent conversation we shared, I became more convinced that this decision wasn't just mine. It was his too, in a way. He just needed a chance to believe that life could be different. And if I had the power to offer him that chance, I couldn't hesitate any longer. I was willing to fight for him, not just as an aunt, but as the person who could give him what he needed most: a home. The decision to adopt Jamie caused an uproar in my family, not just because of the responsibility it entailed, but because the reactions from my family, especially my mother and my aunts, were far from simple. They had always been attached to a traditional view of things. For them, family had an order, a hierarchy. And at the top of that hierarchy was my sister Laura, Jamie's mother. I was nothing more than the aunt, someone who should care from a distance without interfering in a role that, in their eyes, only the biological mother had the right to fulfill. Deep down, I already knew what was coming. It wouldn't be a surprise. But still, I felt unprepared for their reactions, especially my mother's. We had always been very close, but I knew that this decision could break that closeness. As soon as the conversation about adoption began, it didn't take long for the criticisms to start, not only from my mother but also from my aunts. They couldn't understand. They couldn't see that I had more to offer Jamie than the simple role of aunt that life had assigned to me. My mother was the first to confront me. She didn't understand why I wanted to invade Laura's role, as if motherhood was something I didn't have the right to share with her. She thought that by trying to adopt Jamie, I was taking away Laura's opportunity to rebuild her relationship with her son, as if the mere fact that Laura was his biological mother was enough to make her the best option for Jamie. As if Laura's life, marked by dependence and chaos, was somehow more valid than the stability and love I had to offer. As the days went by, the pressure from my family only grew. They were worried about what I was leaving behind, about the risks I was taking. I knew my decision didn't make sense to them. It didn't make sense to them that Jamie needed more than just a biological mother. They didn't see the suffering he carried, didn't see the emotional distance between him and Laura, and didn't understand what it meant for me to see him so lost. They couldn't see that, no matter how much Laura was his mother by blood, what Jamie needed was something she couldn't give him. And then, when my mother and aunts started pushing me more intensely, questioning my ability to be a mother, something inside me became even firmer. No, I didn't know exactly what it meant to be a mother. I didn't know if I would be able to be the mother Jamie needed. But there was one thing I knew, and it was stronger than any doubt I might have had. I knew he needed a home. He needed someone who would love him unconditionally, who would help him find purpose amid the chaos of his life. And that I could offer. I didn't want to take Laura's chance, but the truth was that she had long since stopped being a mother to Jamie. She was lost in her own problems, and although I knew she loved Jamie, her love wasn't enough to guarantee his safety and future. I knew that the only chance Jamie had for a more stable, happier life was with me. I had to be the one to help him find his way, even if it meant facing the resistance of my own family. With each emotional attack, each criticism, I felt more resolute in my decision. I knew I was doing what was right. I wasn't there to compete with my sister, but to give Jamie a real chance at a better life. If my mother and aunts couldn't understand that, there was nothing I could do but move forward. I couldn't let their fear or attachment to the idea of a traditional family stop me from doing what was necessary for Jamie's future. As the days passed, the family confrontations grew more intense, but my certainty that I was on the right path only grew stronger. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew that deep down, no one in my family believed I could do this on my own. But what they didn't see was the strength Jamie gave me. He didn't know it, but he was teaching me more about courage and love than anyone could ever imagine. With each step I took toward him, I got closer to my goal, and I couldn't turn back now. The adoption process was not something I had imagined, even after deciding to go down this path. The bureaucratic part was one of the toughest of all. I knew it would be challenging, but honestly, I had no idea how long everything would drag on or how many tests and evaluations I'd have to undergo to prove I was capable of giving Jamie the stability he needed. First, there were the piles of forms. Every page seemed to ask for more information about my life than I was willing to share. I had to explain everything, from my financial history to my emotional state. It was a test, not only for me, but also for my own fears and insecurities. I was willing to do whatever it took to have Jamie adopted, but at the same time, the idea of being evaluated and questioned in every aspect of my life made me uncomfortable. I had never felt so exposed. And even though I knew it was necessary, the feeling of being watched and measured, as if my life was just a set of qualifications, made me anxious. Then there were the interviews with social workers and psychologists. They always seemed to ask the same questions. Do you feel ready to be a mother? How would you handle difficult situations? What are your plans for Jamie's future? I would answer with confidence, but inside, a voice always questioned, Am I really ready? How could anyone be prepared for something as grand as this? Something so beyond control like adoption? On top of that, there was the emotional weight of the situation. I wasn't just dealing with the fact that I was taking on a huge responsibility, but also with the fear that Jamie might not be accepted. The boy had been through so much, seen so much pain and abandonment, and I was afraid that my offer of a home wouldn't be enough to help him overcome everything he had lived through. I knew that while the process was ongoing, he was feeling just as lost. And the worst part was, even when things were harder for me, I had to stay strong for him. I couldn't show weakness, not when he was beginning to trust me. Then there was the fear of judgment. Every step felt like I was being watched by my family and friends, as if they were waiting to see if I could handle it. The adoption process felt endless, like it would never end, and all the time without concrete answers only increased my nervousness. Every time I went to an interview or filled out a new form, the weight of the responsibility hit me even harder. But there was something else that kept me going. Jamie. He was the reason I was going through all of this. Seeing how, despite all of his traumas and insecurities, he was starting to trust me more, look at me with a softer expression, gave me strength to move forward. It was a small sign that we were on the right path, a sign that I wasn't doing all of this in vain. I felt that with each day I spent with him, even in the small interactions, we were building a stronger connection. I could see him slowly opening up, no longer being that closed-off and distant boy, and I started to see glimpses of who he really was, a child full of dreams, of a desire to improve, but not knowing how. I knew the next few months would be the hardest. There was the legal process, interviews, psychological tests, and constant internal debates about what it meant to be a mother. But deep down, the certainty that this was the only option for Jamie gave me a push to keep going, despite everything. Every difficulty I faced was one step closer to ensuring that he would have a better future. And as all of this unfolded, Jamie was becoming more and more open to me. He started to tell me more about his life, his fears, his dreams. I knew he was still dealing with so much, but the trust he was beginning to place in me was something I never imagined I'd see. I still had a lot of fear. Fear of failing, fear of not being enough, fear that he would never accept me as the mother he never had. But in the end, there was no turning back. I had made the decision. And now it was a matter of moving forward, of being the best person I could be for him. Even if the road was longer and harder than I had imagined, it didn't matter. I was going to keep going until the end, for him, for both of us. Life with Jamie was finally beginning to settle into a routine. Over the months, things started falling into place in a way I wasn't sure would happen. He was adapting, and in some way I was too. Of course, it wasn't perfect. There were days when he seemed like he wanted to hide from everything, when his gaze still showed a sadness he didn't know how to hide. But at other times, I could see the boy he could become. Creative, with an energy that reminded me of the good times of childhood, before things got complicated. Things at school were starting to improve, and it was there that I saw one of the biggest changes. Jamie had always told me about the bullying he suffered. The kids weren't kind to him. The image he had of himself seemed more fragile with each story he shared. But over time, I noticed something shift. Jamie, who once went unnoticed, began to be seen in a different light. He found refuge in art. His talent for drawing, which had always been there, started to stand out. A simple notebook became his way of escaping. He began showing me his drawings more often, and I saw how he used art to express everything he couldn't put into words. I was surprised when he told me he won a contest at school. The smile on his face when he said it was one of the most genuine things I'd ever seen. Not because he won, but because for the first time in a long time, he seemed proud of himself. To me, that small step meant everything. It was the first time he saw himself in something positive, something he achieved on his own. That was enough to bring a spark to his eyes, something I hadn't seen since he came into my life. But despite these victories, the challenge of dealing with my family remained. They weren't convinced. The decision to adopt Jamie was still a recurring topic in family gatherings, and the criticism never stopped. They still couldn't understand. There was a sense of guilt that seemed to weigh on every word they spoke. My mother, still with that worried look, felt uncomfortable with the fact that I was taking Jamie away from his biological mother. Even after all this time, she couldn't accept that my sister wasn't the right person to care for him. Sometimes, I wondered if my decisions were the right ones. I wondered if Jamie should really go back to Laura, if he would be better off with her. I didn't want to deny him the chance to rebuild the bond with his mother, but at the same time, there was a part of me that knew I couldn't let that happen. Laura, with her life destroyed by substance abuse and the chaos she lived in, was no longer a viable option. Jamie needed stability, and I knew that, even though I had doubts about my ability to be the mother he needed, I couldn't fail him now. Despite all the obstacles, I knew that the most important thing was what we were building together. I saw Jamie begin to stand out at school, and although the family environment was still a battleground, within our home, things were changing. He was no longer the scared and withdrawn boy who arrived. He was starting to grow. Sometimes he even surprised me with a word of affection, a gesture of warmth that I never thought I'd see. He was starting to open up to the world again, and I was there to closely watch this process. There were times when the weight of my family's criticism still hit me. It wasn't easy facing the people I loved, those who still didn't understand what was going on and still believed I was acting impulsively. But when I looked at Jamie, I saw that all the effort, all the emotional wear and tear I was enduring was worth it. He was blossoming, and that was all I could ask for. And despite all the difficulties, I began to realize that my resistance to these external pressures was making me stronger. Every time someone from my family attacked me, I stood firmer. I knew I was doing what was right. My priority wasn't to please everyone, but to ensure Jamie had the opportunity to be happy, to become the person he deserved to be. He needed love and support, and I was willing to give everything I had in me to help him grow, overcome his traumas, and find his place in the world. With each passing day, I felt more confident in the decision I made. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would still be obstacles ahead, but I now knew what really mattered. I couldn't let the fear of what others thought stop me from doing what was right for Jamie. He deserved to be happy, and I was going to fight for that until the end. Time seemed to finally begin working in our favor. Jamie was more confident, more secure, and I was starting to believe that, with time, we could build the life he had always deserved. Of course, there were still tough moments, but the small victories were the ones that really mattered. The connection we built was stronger than anything else. We had something that no criticism, no external pressure could destroy. But the big surprise came from where I least expected it. Laura. There was something inevitable about the distance between us. Even with all the emotional strain the situation caused, a part of me always believed that someday, Laura might wake up to reality and realize what was happening. I knew she still loved her son, even though her life had been shattered by her own choices. And suddenly, things began to change. One morning, when I opened my mailbox, I found a letter. It was something I hadn't expected. It had no return address, but I knew immediately who had sent it. It was from Laura. The letter was written in a way I never imagined. It was sincere, simple, and full of regret. She didn't ask to re-enter Jamie's life immediately, but she apologized. In her words, I could feel the pain and remorse, something she had always hidden behind a facade of indifference. She acknowledged her mistakes, the harm she caused Jamie and all of us. She recognized that he was better off with me, and that perhaps it was time to let the past go and accept the reality. She wrote that she was sorry for how her life had become a tangled mess of wrong choices, that she knew she couldn't change the past, but that she was determined to change the future. I believed her words, but at the same time, I knew it wasn't that simple. Jamie wasn't ready to reconnect with her. I saw it in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided talking about her, all told me that he still wasn't in a place where he could forgive. He was stronger, but the wound she left hadn't healed. How could I force something he wasn't ready to face? How could I demand that he restart with her when he was just beginning to understand what it meant to be truly loved? I replied to the letter, but in a way that I knew would protect him. I told Laura that I was open to talking, but that things couldn't go back to normal right away. Jamie needed time. He needed more stability before something so delicate could be rebuilt. It wasn't something I wanted to do to push Laura away, but rather to protect Jamie, to make sure he didn't get lost in unfulfilled promises. Her letter left me torn. On one hand, there was a genuine desire to see my sister rise again, to see her become the mother Jamie would need. But on the other hand, I knew it couldn't be done just anyway. Not until she showed that she was truly willing to change, that she was ready to rebuild her life in a way that was healthy for everyone. I knew that Jamie's pain ran deeper than he wanted to admit, more complex than I could understand. He was starting to rediscover himself, but there was still a lot of work to be done. The time he spent away from Laura, the pain he suffered because of her choices, wouldn't disappear overnight. He needed more time, more security. I knew that. So, I moved forward. I continued to give him all the support he needed, always trying to be the foundation he never had. Each day that passed, he was stronger, more confident, more able to express himself. And I was there, firm, by his side. What mattered now was the present. The future was yet to be shaped, and I knew the decisions we made now would be crucial for what lay ahead. Jamie was flourishing, and at the same time, our relationship, the one he and I had, was becoming stronger and stronger. The pain of the past still existed, but it was no longer the only thing that defined our path. And deep down, even with all the uncertainty, I knew that, in the end, he had found a safe place to be himself. And for me, that was enough.